Hello and welcome again to our lecture series on Jews in the Golan and antiquity. Today we're going to be talking about synagogues of the Golan. Synagogues are probably some of the buildings best known and remains of the Jewish community that once lived in the Golan 2,000 years ago. And we'll be discussing some remains of these incredible buildings and what they can tell us about the communities that built them and used them. So today we'll begin talking with the synagogue from Gamla, which is the earliest synagogue known today in the Golan. And this is a Roman period synagogue from the time of the Second Temple. We will then talk about synagogues from the Byzantine period. We're going to jump a few hundred years. And these are synagogues that existed at the time the land of Israel was under Christian rule. And then we'll go a bit back in time to discuss Roman period synagogues, which is actually a new idea inside of research. And we'll be presenting the evidence we have for this time period of Roman period synagogues in the Golan. We'll begin taking a general look at synagogues in the land of Israel. I'm talking now from the Roman and Byzantine periods, from the 1st century BCE until the 6th, 7th centuries CE. You're looking at a website from Kinneret College, a place I work, where we've created a website in which you can see updated versions of how many synagogues actually existed in the land of Israel and some information on each one. Today we count about 130 synagogues that we know of in the land of Israel. Some we actually just have remains of an inscription or a design. In many of them we have remains of the building. But what's interesting is to note that the majority of the synagogues are in the northern Israel, in the area of the Galilee and the Golan. This is of course of a historical reason that only in those areas in northern Israel where the Jewish community continue following the destruction of the first revolt and then the second revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt. Only from there do Jewish communities really continue en masse up until some time in the 7th, 8th, or 9th centuries. In the area of the Golan, we know of about 30-something synagogues. And these synagogues are concentrated in the central western Golan, in the area that was called Golanitis in antiquity. And something we discussed in our first lecture, that the name Golan refers to the central Golan in antiquity and was not used as the name for all of Golan as it is today. If you look at the map on the right-hand side, you can clearly see that the Jewish area is in the western central Golan, and around there was actually more of a Christian area, pagan areas in the Roman period, but it's that area had a continuous Jewish presence for around 800 years, and it's that area where there remains of some 30-something synagogues. So of these synagogues that we see today, we notice that only 10 of them have actually been excavated. So actually leaves a lot of room for research in the future, and not all of them have actually been published with final publications. 2 of these are well dated to the Roman period. Gamla in the 1st century, and Majdulia, which has a phase from the 1st century and was abandoned at the end of the 3rd century. And all the rest have been dated mainly to the Byzantine period. But as we see today, some of them actually continue from an earlier Roman period time. We'll begin with the early Roman synagogues. Early Roman synagogues are rare to find in the land of Israel. We know of about 15 today. And I say about 15 because at about half of them, there's disagreements among scholars. Is it really a synagogue? Is it not a synagogue? So from that half, there's only, let's say, scholars only agree about half of them, and the rest of them, we're not really sure if they're synagogues or not. But we'll talk about one today, which there is consensus, and that, of course, is the early Roman period synagogue from Gamla. Let's define what we mean by early Roman. We're talking now about the end of the Second Temple period. So these are built at the time that the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, still exists in Jerusalem, and that's the major center of religious and political and cultural life for Jews in the area. But they also have been building synagogues, and these synagogues have interesting characteristics that will differ them from the ones we know from the later time periods. These early Roman synagogues being built at the time of the temple, some of them continue even after the time of the destruction of the temple, but by the end of the 2nd century, synagogues were already changed, and really they can belong to a second group, and they're not similar to the ones that were before. So we'll be testing the one from Gamla. Now, why do we see the one from Gamla? The truth is, there may be many more early Roman synagogues in the country, but if a site continues for 700, 800 years, you don't see the remains of the earlier time periods. What you see in the end is really the later time periods and only hints from the earlier time. As an archaeologist, what you hope to find is a good level of destruction. We're people who like an earthquake, we like a war. Our best thing, of course, would be if you can have an eruption of a volcano, Mount Vesuvius and Pompeii, which preserves the remains in an amazing way. And even the Golan Basaltic Plateau, and even though it's dormant and not extinct, well, we didn't see that happened in the past thousands of years. But we do have is the destruction of Gamla. And why Gamla is such an important site for many reasons. It's important for anyone who wants to study Roman military history. And it's also important for the study of everyday Jewish life. And it's because it was destroyed in the Great Revolt. And it was not resettled afterwards on large, meaning that the remains just were left there until archaeologists came and started excavating the site in the 1970s. Here we're going to take a look at the Synagogue of Gamla. Whoever wants some more information, the Synagogue of Gamla was published in the book called Gamla 2, The Architecture, and this actually is available online. So we'll take now a look at the Synagogue of Gamla. This building was discovered in the 1970s under Shmarya Gutman's excavation of the site. He saw a few remains on top, which led him to believe maybe there's a public building in this area. He didn't know it would be a synagogue. And following his excavation, he identified this large public building that he saw has a early Roman period synagogue. It's rectangular in shape. It has benches going along the walls. And as you can see, it actually has a raised area on the sides, and a lower floor going in the middle. The entranceway, which here is on the southwestern side, goes directly to the lower floor. And there's the raised floors above, which you can ascend to by going through the benches, which will also act as stairs. Around the lower floor are pillars, which are used, of course, to hold up the roof. Here we're taking another look at it, looking out towards the south, where we can see the synagogue. Notice that you can see a raised area, which looks like a bunch of steps, where those are actually used as benches of the synagogue. The floor only had remains of a basalt floor somewhere in the middle, and the rest of it, it's not clear what it was. Here you can see kind of a gravel used on top of it for the preservation, but it may have had a dirt floor or maybe used maps, and maybe there was a continuous stone floor which was taken apart at the time of the revolt and was not preserved when archaeologists found it. Now, I guess part of the question here is, well, why is this building a synagogue? It gets to a larger question, which you don't really have too much time to go into here, of how are early Roman period synagogues identified? How you identify a building as a synagogue at the time the temple was in existence. Because these buildings do not face Jerusalem. They do not have a place that you can see in the wall where the Torah scrolls were kept. We do not see an Aron Kodesh, an edicula. So these buildings also do not have inscriptions that were found inside of them, mentioning that they're a synagogue. So why did Shmarya Gutman identify as a synagogue? Part of it is a logical reason. It's clear that Gamla was a Jewish site at the time. We know it was Jewish from archaeological remains that showed it was Jewish, such as stone vessels and coins and other remains. And we also know it was Jewish based upon the descriptions of Josephus Flavius of the site. But we also can make parallels. Archaeology is a science where we use parallels all the time to try and understand what we're digging. When Shmarya Gutman excavated in Gamla in the 1970s, there had already been two buildings identified by other archaeologists as synagogues, but further to the south. The first one, of course, is the well-known Synagogue of Masada, identified in the 1960s by Yigal Yadin. The truth is, Gutman was also part of those who excavated at the site, so he knew the synagogue well. And Yigal Yadin, in his excavation at Masada, found a building, a public building at a Jewish site, with benches going along the walls, meaning that this is a building used for communal activity. And he identified as a synagogue because he also found remains of a geniza, remains of parchment, scroll remains inside, which he identified as being used in a geniza at the site, and therefore he knew there was also a sort of religious ritual use to the building. So the fact that it's a communal building, seen by the pillars and the benches and the space, seen that has a religious function by the scrolls, led Yigal Yadin to say that this is an early Roman period synagogue. Up until the 1960s, nobody ever really identified early Roman period synagogues in archaeology. Following his excavation, a synagogue was identified by the Franciscans and later by Israeli archaeologists at the site of Herodian, south of Beit Lechem. And at this site here as well, A triclinium of Herod was turned into a public building, into a synagogue, by the people who revolted. Same as happened at Gamla. Same as happened at Masada, where that building was also turned into a synagogue by those Jews who revolted. And so here we also see benches along the walls. We see a raised floor on the sides and a lower floor in the middle. And Herodium was similar to Masada. And Masada, of course, was identified as a synagogue. So when Gutman then comes to Gamla, he is able to say, well, this is similar to Herodium. This is similar to Masada. So I'm now identifying this building as a synagogue. He didn't find scrolls inside of it, but the nature of the building was very similar in its characteristics to other buildings which have been accepted in scholarship as synagogues, and in truth also in buildings that have been found since the time of the excavation of Gamla. What made Gamla unique is that Masada and Herodian were buildings that were turned into synagogues. These were buildings originally built by Herod with different functions, and they were later turned into synagogues by Jews who revolted against the Romans, who made their ways to the sites of Herodian and Masada. Gamla really reflects much more the natural Jewish evolution of a village, which builds a synagogue at the end of the Second Temple period. And it's not some small sect of Jews who are parts of a zealous group who revolts against the Romans, but they're reflecting more of mainstream Jewish life. And that's part of the importance of the building. What we also see in this building, it's built with Doric capitals. It's actually rather plain in its artistic design, and it doesn't face Jerusalem. If we look at it well, the synagogue's oriented to its center. In other words, since there's benches around the whole building, and since there's nothing that in the southern wall or the southwestern wall showing that it should face Jerusalem, its orientation is centralized. And this is one of the things we know is common in early Roman period synagogues. We know from additional sources, which we won't go into now, that these buildings were mainly used as houses of study for reading the Torah, and much less for prayer, if at all. The synagogue from Gamla is a very well-known synagogue, but maybe what's more well-known in the Golan are the Byzantine period synagogues. These buildings, of which there are over 25 of them in the Golan, and only we said before, about 8 of them have been excavated, and not all of them have even been published in full. These synagogues are unique in that they're built from basalt and they have a rich architectural tradition behind them, and it gives us a window into Jewish life at the time, which of course is very important because we don't have really any historical sources about the Jews in the Golan in the 4th, 5th, and 6th and 7th centuries. In our earlier lecture, we had described the fact that Jews in the Golan continued to live there, it seems, after the Great Revolt, after the fall of Gamla, and only really Gamla was affected, and there's a continuous Jewish presence. I mention it because I call these Byzantine period synagogues, and we have to see, well, did they begin earlier when Jews were living there or not? Today we're going to describe 3 of them, Katsrin, Deir Aziz, and Al-Kanatir. There's many more we could describe, but our time is short, so we will try and get what we can from these 3 very interesting sites. And I chose 3 sites which anyone can go and visit today if they go up to the Golan. What's interesting about these sites is even from a careful look at the pictures, you can already notice that these sites differ from each other. And that's part of the story of the Byzantine period synagogues. You know, if you look at synagogues in the land of Israel from the time of the Byzantine period, they actually have characteristics which are geographical. The synagogues in the Beit Valley share certain characteristics with beautiful mosaics. The synagogues of the Upper Galilee have certain characteristics that make them a defined group. And the Golan synagogues have an interesting definition. They're all built of basaltic stones. Most of them only have one entranceway on the main wall. And there's a wall that faces Jerusalem or across from Jerusalem, but there's only one door going into the building. Let's say Galilean synagogues, some have 3. But what really makes the Golan synagogues unique is that they're different from each other. Let's say the Upper Galilean synagogues are much more similar to each other. Bar-Am and Meron are very similar to each other, but the Golan synagogues, it seems like each one is its own world. And even looking here, in Katsrin, for example, the entrance is on the northern wall. In Al-Kanatir, the entrance is on the southern wall, next to the Aron Kodesh, next to the Ark, and it has some minor side entrances on the side. In Deir Aziz, There's a main entranceway on the east and western side, but it's a broad building and not a long building. So as we can see here, the synagogues themselves all really differ from each other. So it's hard just to tell one story of the Golan. You have to look at each synagogue by itself. We'll begin here with Kanatir, known as the site today also has Ein Kshatot. Like many sites in the central Golan, we have no idea what the name was in antiquity. Sites in the southern Golan, some of them preserve their names. But in the central Golan, many of them have names in Arabic, which are more modern day names, sometimes going back 400, 500 years. But it does not seem to us, although we could be wrong, that these names go back 1,500, 2,000 years ago. Kanatir actually means mother of the arches, and is a description given by locals who spoke Arabic over the past couple hundred years, who saw arches at the site, which is actually part of the spring that was built in the Roman Byzantine period, close to the synagogue structure. This synagogue has been reconstructed by the archaeologists who dug there, by Yeshua Drey, Elana Gonen, and Chaim ben David, and it can be visited today. And actually today it's used for weddings and bar mitzvahs, for gatherings, and it's become a very well-known site in the Golan. What made it unique is that when archaeologists came to the site, almost none of the stones had been taken out, very few for secondary use, and therefore they were able to really put back the stones, a process we call anesthesiosis in archaeology, where they put them back exactly where they were from. What we're looking at now here is we're looking from the north to the south, and we're looking actually the southern wall. And notice that the entrance to the synagogue is not across from the ark, it's next to the edicula, the Aron Kodesh, and that's something that may be strange to us today, because in our synagogues today, we put the entranceway across from where we keep the Torah scrolls. And in this case, the orientation is clearly to the south to Jerusalem, but the wall, the entrance, is on the wall, which also where the ark was kept. By the way, this is something we know very much in the Upper Galilee, and it's an interesting Jewish phenomena that we don't have any hint of it in rabbinic texts from the time, but we do know of it as a practice in archaeology. Here we're taking a look at before the reconstruction. We can see some of the pillar column remains on the floor, and we can see how many of these pieces are put in their back exactly where they were found. The edicula, the Aron Kodesh, is actually a particular important example. This is really the only example in the land of Israel of ancient synagogues where edicula, an Aron Kodesh, was reconstructed with, let's say, very, very good certainty that this is how it was. We have some fights about it in archaeology about maybe some small aspects of it, but overall this seems to be the correct reconstruction of the structure you see here. And almost all the sites you go to today, if you see there's the Aron, you see there's the Ark, you should know that there weren't really found the pieces in that spot. And here they were found much close by, and because also many of the pieces were found, a lot of it was able to be reconstructed. And what was not found, so they made copies of those parts and put them in order to give you the full reconstruction. If you take a look to the column, which is reconstructed inside, you can see here some special artwork of the ancient synagogue from the Byzantine period. Notice the art. You can see a menorah, a machta, which is a pan that was used at the temple with coals or for incense, and you can also see a lulav and its rogue. Below that, you'll see some sort of floral designs, which are also very common in Jewish art, but they're not only found in Jewish art. The use of the menorah, the pan, but especially the lulav and its rogue, is something that we only find in Jewish art. Why do I say especially? A menorah, for example, you can find in Samaritan synagogues in the area of the Shomron and outside, because they also use the Bible as an important text, and the menorah appears in their art, as does the machta. But lulav and its rogue is Jewish symbols which are rabbinic interpretation. So it's a clear sign of a Jewish building, and in this geographical area, in any case, was the Jewish area at the time. These three symbols also tell us something about the people who use this building in a few manners. One, this isn't particularly really to Kanatir. I can think of many other examples in the land of Israel where we see these symbols being used, such as at Chamat Tiveria or Tzipori, many times in mosaics. And we can see Jews using these symbols again and again together. It seems that they're relating these symbols, it's possible to holidays, but it seems more likely they're relating these symbols to the temple that was destroyed, the temple that in many ways the synagogue is temporarily taking its place, has a Mikdash Ma'at. In this way, the Byzantine period synagogue of Kanater is very different than Gamla. At Gamla, you see nothing that reminds you of the temple, and this of course makes sense. When the temple's existence, you don't need to remind yourself of it, and not only that, you don't want to build a building that could be in competition to it. At Kanater, we see here now the memory of the temple. We can also see our birds of prey, which may also have some sort of Jewish meaning. They're not particular to Jews, but we see them used many times in Jewish art, especially inside of the synagogues. Below the edicula that you see here, below the Aron Kodesh, below the stairs, there's actually a small room, a small cavity, which some archaeologists think may be the area of a geniza, an area where scrolls were kept. We will now go to another synagogue, a synagogue that's excavated by Tzvika Maoz. And this synagogue over here is the synagogue of Ein Nashut. Ein Nashut is a site a bit to north of Katzrin, and this synagogue has been slightly reconstructed, but mainly you can see how it was found. Some of the nicer pieces are today inside the Israel Antiquities Museum, the museum inside of Katzrin, the Antiquity Museum inside of Katzrin. But if you go to the site, you can still see a lot of the remains that are over there. It's a small walk from a parking area about 10 minutes away, and I smallly suggest that if you go to the Golan, it's a nice site to look at. This synagogue is rather small, and what's interesting about it is that it's very elaborate in its artwork. Here you just see one example on the pedestal that's on the bottom, of which the top of it were columns. This synagogue also has an entranceway on its southern wall. And this synagogue, and I have to go back to Kanater to show you, with this entranceway on the southern wall, has something very interesting that also Kanater has. And if I go back to Kanater, I notice that not only is there an entrance on the southern wall, it's not also in the middle. The entrance is off to the side. And the same thing also happens in Ein Nashut. And this is a Golan phenomena, to have a single entrance on the southern wall, but also to have next to it the ark, but neither is really centered. Maybe together they're centered between the columns, but the portal is not in the center, which so much goes against the canon of stylistic building of classical architecture, which was common in the Roman and Byzantine period. And this seems to be done on purpose by the Jews of the time. But why they would do it that way, and why they wouldn't keep to symmetry, which is one of the main principles of classical architecture, is something that we really don't know. At Ein Nashut, it seems that many of the artistic elements, some were found at the site, but many were taken out of the site prior to the 6-day war and were reused in secondary use by different Syrian villages at the time. Again, their idea of using them is not something that they saw there was a synagogue at the site and there will use the stones, but for villagers who live around the area, who are looking for stones to build with, here they see an abandoned site. And what's interesting about Ein Nashut is the site was abandoned in the 6th century and was not resettled afterwards, which is not something for common at a site in antiquity. It seems that some of the stones in more modern day period were taken to different sites. What you're seeing here now is a stone that was found in the village of Ein Sansam, which is very close to the site we call today Ein Nashut. I should mention that Ein Nashut is a modern name of the site. We don't know what the name is in antiquity. On maps of the 19th century, the site is known as Deir Aziz, but even that doesn't give us a name of what it was in antiquity. So what you're looking at here of this basalt stone that was found in Ein Samsam, it was taken, it seems, out of Ein Nashut. That's at least the theory. And so archaeologists think that this belonged to the synagogue, which is very close by. And what you see is an interesting artistic rendition. Notice again the birds of prey. But next to the birds of prey, you can see 2 lions. And then in the middle of 2 lions, you can see a man with his hands raised. When you see the movement of a person with hands raised in antiquity is usually a sign of prayer. It seems here we have here an artistic motif that comes from the book of Daniel, and we're looking at her is the scene of Daniel in the lion's den. What's interesting also is that we know of Daniel praying as well. In fact, the book of Daniel is one of the first mentions we have of even praying towards Jerusalem. But we see here something that reminds us of Daniel. And Daniel is mentioned in connection with prayer, as put over here. He's connected with the miracle in the lion's den, which is also a story of salvation. And therefore, it seems to be that the Jews who decided on certain artwork wanted a biblical theme and purposely wanted one that deals with prayer and also deals with salvation. Biblical themes in synagogue art are not uncommon. I say not uncommon because we don't see it a lot, but maybe that deals with the preservation. But in places, especially on mosaics, where there's lots of remains, it's not unusual to find biblical themes, such as the sacrificing of Isaac at Beit Alpha, and that's most recently in Jody Magnus's excavations at Hukuk and Uzi Libner's excavations at Wadi Hammam, biblical themes that we can find, such as the Tower of Babel, Pharaoh being drowned. And here we find one in basalt stone. It's just rare to find them in stone. What we're seeing here is that if we take Kanater and Nashot, we can see artistic design in stone that was also found in mosaics in other areas. Meaning that on the one hand, the Jews of the Golan are unique in how they build their synagogues, in the art form that they choose, and in the mode they choose of sticking with sculpture in stone, in most cases. We do have 2 cases of mosaic, which we'll discuss later. But they're also using motifs that you can find in other areas of the country as well. We'll move now on to another synagogue, which is the synagogue at Deir Aziz. This synagogue was excavated by Tzvika Maoz and Chaim ben David, and later by Oren Zingbaum. When you look here, as you're seeing a picture of the synagogue at the beginning of the excavation, and here you note something peculiar about the preservation of the site. Now, the site of Deir Aziz was a site that also became a village at the end of the 19th century and in the 20th century, and later abandoned at the time of the Six-Day War. This site has a large amount of a large amount of dirt that covered it, and while some of the stones were used in secondary use, a lot of the synagogue remained where it was. And here you can see, take a look at the dirt, and take a look at the level then after the excavation, and if you notice the column by the dirt level, it's the same column that you see standing. It's very rare to find something like that in archaeology that was preserved that great. With all you have to do is remove the dirt, and you can find many of the columns and pedestals intact from the time of their abandonment. The synagogue of Deir Aziz is somewhat unique. What makes the synagogue of Deir Aziz unique? Well, what makes part of the synagogue of Deir Aziz unique is the fact that it's a broad room synagogue, meaning that it's not long north-south, as was in Nashot, but really Kanater. Haz is also the synagogue in Katzrin. But the synagogue here is long going east-west. So right now we're looking towards the west, the east wall being close to us, the west wall being further away, looking over the Sea of Galilee, and the southern wall on the left-hand side, where you can see the person is working on brushing it off. And this makes it unique amongst the Golan synagogues. Also, you can see 2 main entranceways, the eastern one, which is probably earlier, and likely a later edition of the western one. This synagogue, like its predecessors, has benches going around it and has an apse on its southern wall, but it's not being centered in the middle of the building, which is something you would expect to happen. Here we can see the apse that sticks out of the western wall, the southern wall of the site, showing the Jerusalem orientation. Unlike Gamla, these synagogues are oriented towards Jerusalem. And we know this either because the entrance on the ark on the southern wall, or in this case, we have an apse, a vaulted structure, circular structure as part of the southern wall, which shows you that this is an important area. It seems that the ark, the edicula, was actually here inside this area of the apse. Another interesting find at Deir Aziz were stairs. Okay, out of everything we talked about where we saw pillars and columns and artwork, who really cares about stairs? Why are stairs so interesting? Well, it gets to a question we have for many ancient synagogues, not just in the Golan, but throughout the land of Israel, and that is, was there a second story? It's clear to us that many synagogues had a raised roof. In other words, there are columns of a wider diameter on the bottom, of a smaller diameter going up, and a tall raised roof, maybe being buildings of 15 to 20 meters high. However, was there actually a gallery or a place to sit or stand on the upper level? Mention, I do not say a woman's gallery, because we have absolutely no evidence for a partition of men and women in the ancient synagogues. This gets actually to a discussion for which we won't go into now, about what was the place of the woman inside of the ancient synagogue. Did they sit mixed? Did they sit separately inside the building? Or did they not go so much to the building itself? There are different theories in archaeology depending on what sources you're using, what structures you're looking at. But here we can see that there's clearly evidence of a second story being used, not just as a raised roof area, but actually has a floor that was likely there because you have stairs going up to it. Another interesting part of Deir Aziz is that there clearly were different stages. During the excavation of Deir Aziz, which the later stage is dated to the 6th century, what you see here, archaeologists found in the southern wall remains of an earlier Aron Kodesh. This Aron Kodesh, this ark for which Torah scrolls were kept, the edicula, was found in secondary use inside the southern wall. Which means is that at some point when they redid the building, the people, the Jews of Deir Aziz, they didn't want to just throw away the early Aron Kodesh, and what they did is they used it and they put it as kind of a geniza as part of rebuilding the southern wall of the site. When archaeologists took a look at this earlier edicula, Aron Kodesh, they found in parts of it inscription in Greek. Remember that Jews at this time are speaking Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek. Without going into the whole inscription, two names here are mentioned in Greek. One is the name of Judeos. Judeos, of course, is the Greek version of Yehuda. So we see here Judeos, and the second name is Azizo. Azizo is a very interesting name. Azizo appears on the inscription, but archaeologists today think that this might just be by chance that the site is called Deir Aziz, because there's no reason to think that anyone who called the site Deir Aziz the past 100 of years knew that there was someone there named Azizo on the inscription. On the other hand, it's such a strange chance find, it's hard to know if there's not a connection, and it remains a question today, how is it that the site is named Deir Aziz, which has a meaning in Arabic, and the name is similar to the name of one of the Jews who's involved in the building named Azizo. On this same inscription, a year appears. Now, years are very uncommon to find in the ancient synagogues, and they're important because they can help us establish when a synagogue was built or when it was redone. In this case, on that same inscription, we have the year 290. The question is, of course, 290 to what counting? Of course, Jews in the ancient world did not count according to the time of the birth of Jesus, which we call today of the Common Era, or AD, right? Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. The Jews did not according to the Christian counting, but they would count as many people did in the ancient world. The truth is, Christians didn't count according to the Christian counting up until a couple hundred years later. So what are they counting 290 to? One theory may be they're counting to the time of the destruction of the temple, which would put the building of part of the first stage at the year 360. It's also that maybe they're counting to the time, the year of the founding of the major city in the area, the major city being Hippos Susita. So it would be 290 years for the time of the founding of Susita, which would then put this more into the 3rd century. It's not clear today. There's other options as well. But it's one of the mysteries of Deir Aziz that we do have a year. What we just don't know is what they were dating the year to. It's definitely earlier than the 6th century, in which many of which the dating shows from coins found under the floor of the later stage. Well, we've seen now some synagogues from the Byzantine period, dated from the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. We saw a synagogue from the early Roman period, and I sort of skipped the whole time period from the year 67, let's say up until around the year 400. What happened in between? On the one end, we know there were Jewish communities in the Golan at this time, and on the other hand, we don't really see many remains of their synagogues in the archaeological evidence. In the past few years, we see some hints of more remains that tells us something about the synagogue structures of the Roman period. And we've been able to fill in a gap, a lacuna that we have had dealing with the synagogues of that time. This takes us to our research that we've done on Majdulia, a site I've been excavating over the past 10 years, a village from the Roman period, which is right on the southern end of Golanitis and the northern end of the Hippos district. It's kind of on the southern area of where the major Jewish area settled in the Golan in antiquity. The first to notice Majdulia was Gottlieb Schumacher, the famous German scholar who surveyed the Golan in the end of the 19th century. And he came to the site, and what he says about the site actually does not make it a promising site for research. He says, I visited the elders of the village of El Al, near the village of Eliad today, and he says that they told me about this place called El Majdulia, who I only know of accidentally, and appear to have disappeared from the memory of the most persons. The ruin on the Wadi Mukar does not present anything of interest. He mentions the site of being nothing of interest. Why do I mention it as being important? Because even surveyors who have been to that site after 1967 never noticed remains of a public building or of a synagogue at the site. All they saw was a village from the Roman period that did not continue into the Byzantine period. So that makes it a good site for studying the Roman period. But they saw a site that didn't have lots of remains. Notice that sites like Ein Nashot, or Uma Kanatir, or Katzrin. So when scholars came there, they saw the remains of the synagogue. And at other sites where they didn't see the remains of the synagogue, well, they saw the pieces of the synagogue scattered in the village. At El Majdulia, that's not what you found. You found a site that really didn't seem like there was too much inside of it. This is following our excavation. We excavated different areas at the site. And this is important because a synagogue does not exist by itself. A synagogue is part of a village. That village has in it dwellings. It has industrial areas such as pottery kilns. It has olive presses. And it has different areas inside of it, including also the area of the public building, the synagogue, like you see over here. Our goal in studying Majdulia was not to study a synagogue. That's just part of it. It was to study a village from the Roman period. The truth is, when we started the excavation, we didn't know it was a Jewish village. We didn't know there was a synagogue. All we knew is that this is a village which dates to the Roman period, but does not continue into the Byzantine, which made it a great site for understanding the Roman because you don't have that continuation. So it kind of gives you a frozen moment in time. Here we can see the area of the synagogue, area A on the satellite photo, on the eastern edge of the site. And here you can see the building during the excavation, a rectangular building, and we'll take a closer look in a second. Here we're taking a look at the building. The building has a phase from the 1st century, and mainly what you see here is the last phase of the synagogue, when it was abandoned sometime around the year 270. I say around the year 270 because 270 is the latest coins that we have at the site of Majdulia. To date, I don't know how to tell you why it was abandoned. Other villages were abandoned around this time as well, but we know that the village, like other villages in the area of the Golan and the Galilee as well, were abandoned. And it might not be a Jewish phenomena, it's likely a wider phenomena that caused the village to be abandoned. Here we're taking a look before we actually found the synagogue. Notice that you don't really see any remains of it. There's actually a winter pool there at the site. And now you're taking a look at our remains in the beginning. This is our archaeological survey. What brought us to the site? Well, we saw some column remains, but nothing grandiose, no really nice artistic remains, and therefore we thought there might be part of a public building. And if you can also see in the back, there's remains of some hewn stones, which were later we found out that were actually benches of the synagogue. But everything else was covered over. Here you can see those hewn stones, which will later be found to be remains of the benches. All of this waiting in a field that no one had really surveyed intensely. And also we, as well as when we began there, didn't even know that it was a synagogue. Following our survey, we found more and more remains around the site. The cows helped us actually found some of the remains as well, as they would eat the grassy area around, revealing to us some more of the remains. And eventually we found remains of the synagogue. Here you can see the synagogue. The synagogue here is being oriented towards the picture to the east. Next to it are some pottery kilns. And to the west of it, which would be below, is the residential area of the site. The synagogue has from few remains that we date to the early Roman period, meaning its first phase dates to around the time of the Second Temple period, but it's hard for us to understand this level very well because the later time period reused the stone and seems to have ruined a lot of that earlier building. What you see here now in yellow are walls that we dated into the Second Temple period, revealing a wide structure from that time, which we identified as likely being a synagogue structure, as well as you can also see remains of a Doric column, as you see over there on the side, which was found in secondary use in the later building. Maybe somewhat similar to what was found in Deir Aziz, where remains of the earlier synagogue were kept as a geniza inside the building of the later synagogue. We're going to focus on the later synagogue stage of the 3rd century of the Roman period, because those are remains that are dated well, and we can see well what life was like at that time. Okay, so we're looking over here now at the Majdulia, and notice the plan of the site. It had a kind of a wide courtyard, and the inside of the building split the synagogue into 2 levels. It has a raised area on the sides, which appear kind of in a lighter gray on the plan, and the middle area, which is a lower floor in the middle. So it has raised sides and a lower floor. This should remind us a bit of what we saw at Gamla, which also has raised sides and a lower floor. Notice how the main entrance of Gamla goes to the lower floor. The same thing happens in the village, in the ancient synagogue of Majdulia. Notice here there are 3 entranceways, but they're on the western wall. It has benches going along the outer walls, but it also has benches going inside the synagogue, going north-south. So there's outer benches and inner benches, very similar to also what we noticed in Gamla, where there's the raised floors, which also had benches around the walls, and a lower floor, where there's also benches between the upper and lower floor. So here we're taking a look at the remains of some of the benches that were found in Majdulia. It's the only building at the site which used hewn stones, and it's one of the few Golan synagogues has an entrance on the western side, meaning its entrance has no particular connection with Jerusalem. The building is not oriented to Jerusalem, it's oriented to the middle of the site. We found mason marks on the stones, which tell us something probably about how the synagogue was built, where masons were invited to come and using local stone in order to build the synagogue. We also found some of the artistic works, but here it's very plain. In fact, the style we have is a very plain style, reminiscent of Gamla in many ways, and the use of only Doric capitals at the site. You find much more elaborate designs in the later synagogues, and here we can see a much simpler type of use. Was this showing that they weren't wealthy enough to use something more? In my mind, might be ideological, that if the synagogue began at the time of the Second Temple, even if it continued after its destruction, they don't want to build a building they see as competition to the temple. We also found roof tiles. Roof tiles belong to the second phase. Gamla was a flat roof. There were no roof tiles being used at the time of Gamla. Roof tiles also tell you that the roof was raised and was a high roof, meaning the building was a prominent building. Our biggest surprise were remains of a mosaic floor. It was a surprise because the preservation of the site is not great. In some places, the walls are missing, many of the stones are missing. Only a single row of stones is what's found in most of the areas. And the mosaic was mainly not preserved. In fact, the whole foundation of the mosaic seemed to have been washed away. And if you look here, you can notice that the mosaic almost rests on the dirt and soil of the Golan. Here we can see some of the remains. We found remains of geometric designs. And we also found in the middle some very interesting remains. More in the middle on the southern side, which you now take a close-up look at this. Notice here the legs of a bird and of an animal that were found. And we also have a panel which shows an animal with 4 legs. What is this? Is it an artistic scene? Is it some biblical scene? We don't know because we don't have a good preservation. What we do know is that the mosaic covered the whole site. There are small stones of a very, very high quality. The animals here suggest that it might be some sort of, likely a biblical scene. That's what you see in other synagogues, but it's possible it's also something else. What's important is that we're seeing the use of animal design inside of an ancient synagogue. And this is one of the earliest evidence of Jews using a design of animals inside a synagogue, something that seemed to have not been allowed at the time of the Second Temple, but makes its way into Jewish art following the destruction of the temple. If we take a look now, we set out the roof. The roof is something particularly important at this site. We found many, many roof tiles. Here you see a map of sites in the land of Israel in which roof tiles were found. And all of these sites really belong to the late Roman or Byzantine period. Roof tiles are the common roofing used at site. What's interesting is that they're made of material not local to the site itself. They may have been brought in, the soil, the clay, or the roof tiles themselves brought in from a production someplace to the west of the site. And it's something we're still trying to figure out today. Where did they get the roof tiles from to make the building? Here we take a look at the difference between synagogues with roof tiles and without roof tiles. Notice the buildings on top. Number one is actually the synagogue from Gamla. And number two is an early Roman period synagogue from Kiryat Sefer, not far from Modi'in. The other synagogues are synagogues from the Galilee and the Golan. Notice the difference if you have a flat roof or if you have a tiled roof. Notice the meaning of the synagogue. The synagogue structure, the flat roof, is a much more humble structure. The synagogue with a raised roof is a prominent structure in the landscape of the village. There's hints of this even in rabbinic texts. Rabbinic texts in the Mishnah, which is a source dating mainly from the 1st, 2nd centuries, notes that you should not shotchim gago perot. That on the roof of a synagogue, this is an abandoned synagogue, you should not be drying fruit on top of its roof. Clearly here, the Mishnah is referring to a flat roof synagogue, like was used at Masada, Erodian, and Gamla. Later rabbinic sources clearly talk about a synagogue needs to be built at the height of a village, or that the building itself needs to be the tallest structure. Now I brought some of the sources here that show you that idea. These ideas are not from the time of the Second Temple, not from the time of Gamla, they're from later. What we see in Majdulia is the evidence of this change. In our opinion, Majdulia likely in its first stage had a flat roof, but at some point a roof tiles were added to the building because there was a change in the Jewish attitudes towards the building, that it should become a much more prominent structure in the village landscape. The same can be said of the mosaic floor. Using pictorial designs of people or animals was forbidden in Jewish law. But we do have evidence in the Jerusalem Talmud that a change happened. What's interesting is that this change that's mentioned being in the 3rd century and early 4th century is a change that is noted in the Jerusalem Talmud of one that not that the rabbis encouraged it, but they used the phrase of velo machu beyadaihu. In other words, that they allowed it to happen and they didn't protest the use of it. So maybe the idea of using these designs, of using depictions of animals or people, something really forbidden if you look at even biblical law, but it makes its way into Jewish art. And here we can tell that Majdulia is one of the earliest evidence of this being used in the land of Israel. If I take a look at Majdulia in the 3rd century, I see something interesting, because is it more like Gamla or is it more like the Byzantine period synagogues? And what I see from Majdulia is the following. I show you here 1st, 2nd century synagogues, the general characteristics in the country, and then the Byzantine period synagogues from the 4th through 8th centuries, their general characteristics in the country. And if I see, what do I see at Majdulia? And now I can show you the following. Majdulia, in its outer way it's being built, follows the early Roman period synagogues, but it has additions that are much like the later synagogues, meaning it's a transitional synagogue. Because the site was abandoned, we probably don't see the nice, beautiful designs that we saw in Kanater or in Nashot. But we may have been able to see that if it had lasted a bit later. Well, following Majdulia on this find, we went back to the other synagogues and we said, we know they're dated to the Byzantine period. Are there earlier phases? Going back to Kanater, under the floor, there are actually remains of an earlier public building where pillars were found, columns were found under the floor, and remains of what been a bench. The later synagogue, much, in a certain sense, I don't want to say destroyed, but covers up this earlier building, reusing its stones, making it almost impossible to find. And this is probably what happened at many areas in the Golan, but because much of the floor area was taken apart, remains of this earlier synagogue was found, dating to the 3rd century, the time of the last phase of Majdulia. The same can be found in surveys. We went back to surveying sites in the Golan, and here we surveyed sites that were dated to the Roman period, but did not continue to the Byzantine period. All of these sites, what kind of made them unique was that archaeologists didn't find remains of public structures at them. But following Majdulia and Kanatir, we went back and resurveyed these sites, and we found the following. Here you see a chart of some remains of public remains that were found at these sites. Did we find column fragments? Did we find ashlars? Well, at 4 of them, we found none. And at other sites, when we resurveyed them, we found remains. And I don't want to say they're synagogues, but they hint to the fact that maybe there were synagogues at those sites. Here in the area, for example, is the site of Majme, not far from Katsrin, where we found hewn stones, as well as part of a Doric capital. It's possible at this site there was a synagogue. I remind you that in Majdulia, that's how the excavation began. It seems because the Roman period synagogues overall are much more, we could say, humble and less grandiose in ornament in their art, so they did not leave as much remains, giving us this impression that the Roman period sites almost didn't even have synagogues. If we want to summarize what we saw today, we tried to understand the Jewish community through looking through the different synagogues. We looked at the early Roman period of synagogue. We looked at some small examples from the Byzantine period, where there are many more also to look at as well. And we took a look at our newest theory today in archaeology today, filling in that gap where we do think there are remains of Roman period synagogues. Some seem to be underneath the Byzantine period, as we found at Kanatir and recently at Katsrin. And some may even be at sites which did not continue into the Byzantine period, but they'll be hard to see if we don't excavate. And we won't really know if they're synagogues or not until we further excavate those sites. So there's a lot more to know, and maybe in a few years we could have the same lecture again, but showing new evidence and new information on the Jews of the Golan. Thank you very much.